The night air over southeastern England trembled with the grinding roar of tank battalions on the move. German reconnaissance crews, hidden across the channel, pressed headphones tight against their ears, frantically scribbling notes. Hundreds of armored vehicles, maybe thousands. The sound was unmistakable. Steel tracks chewing through mud, diesel engines howling, commanders barking orders through field radios. But there wasn't a single real tank within 15 miles. June 1944. The Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied Europe hung in the balance. Adolf Hitler had fortified the entire Atlantic Wall with concrete bunkers, machine gun nests, and 500,000 soldiers waiting for the inevitable assault. He knew it was coming. The question that consumed him, that kept his generals arguing through sleepless nights, was simple: where? Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the English Channel, seemed obvious. It was closest to England, just 20 miles of dark water separating the Third Reich from its most determined enemy. Hitler's 15th Army, his most powerful force, sat poised there like a coiled spring, waiting to crush any invasion force the moment it touched French soil. What Hitler didn't know, what his entire military intelligence apparatus failed to grasp, was that they were watching ghosts. Across the fields of Kent and Essex, a phantom army was assembling. The 1st U.S. Army Group, commanded by the fearsome General George S. Patton himself, bristled with power that made German intelligence officers break into cold sweats. Their aerial reconnaissance photographs showed endless rows of tanks, artillery batteries, supply depots, and landing craft crowding every harbor. Radio intercepts confirmed massive troop movements. Double agents reported division after division arriving from America. Every single piece of intelligence pointed to Pas-de-Calais, and every single piece was a lie. This is the story of the most audacious military deception in human history. The invisible army that fooled Hitler, opened the door to D-Day, and changed the course of World War II. Before you go further into this rabbit hole of espionage and illusion, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment about the craziest military strategy you've ever heard of. You're about to discover that truth is stranger than any spy novel. By late 1943, Winston Churchill and Franklin D. Roosevelt faced a brutal calculus. The Soviet Union was hemorrhaging soldiers on the Eastern Front, grinding through Hitler's Wehrmacht in a meat grinder of unprecedented scale. Stalin demanded action. The Western Allies needed to open a second front, to split Hitler's attention and resources, or risk watching the Red Army bleed out alone. The Tehran Conference in November 1943 sealed the decision: Operation Overlord, a massive amphibious invasion of France scheduled for spring 1944, the largest seaborne assault in military history. Everything depended on it. But everyone knew the invasion was coming. German commanders studied maps, calculated distances, analyzed tides and weather patterns. Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox himself, commanded Army Group B along the French coast. He wasn't a man easily fooled. Neither was Hitler, whose paranoid brilliance had carried him through years of warfare. The Allies faced a mathematical nightmare. Even with 6,000 naval vessels, 11,000 aircraft, and 150,000 troops ready for the first wave, they would be outnumbered if the Germans knew where to concentrate their forces. If Rommel could mass both his 7th and 15th armies at the invasion point, the beaches would run red with Allied blood. The invasion would fail. The war might be lost. British intelligence, already masters of deception from operations across North Africa and the Mediterranean, proposed something extraordinary. Not just misdirection, but the creation of an entire alternate reality that Hitler would find more believable than the truth. They called it Operation Bodyguard, an umbrella of interconnected deceptions designed to paralyze German decision-making. Within Bodyguard lived Operation Fortitude, split into two prongs. Fortitude North would convince Hitler an invasion of Norway was imminent, forcing him to keep divisions locked in Scandinavia. Fortitude South would do something even more ambitious. It would conjure an army group out of thin air. The London Controlling Section, a secret committee of Allied military officers, began planning in December 1943. Their weapon wouldn't be bullets or bombs. It would be belief, manufactured, cultivated, and fed to the enemy until it became more real than reality itself. The deception required three elements working in perfect harmony: physical props that could fool aerial reconnaissance, radio traffic that would convince German signals intelligence, and human agents who could sell the lie face-to-face with enemy handlers. For the physical deception, the Allies turned to an unlikely group of soldiers. On January 20, 1944, the U.S. Army activated the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, officially a support unit. Unofficially, they would become known as the Ghost Army. 1,100 men strong, the 23rd was unlike any military unit ever assembled. Their ranks included artists recruited from New York and Philadelphia art schools, fashion designers, architects, sound engineers, radio operators, and actors. Bill Blass, who would later become a fashion icon, served alongside Ellsworth Kelly, destined for greatness in modern art. The unit's average IQ tested at 119, one of the highest in the entire U.S. Army. These weren't traditional soldiers. They were illusionists preparing for the greatest magic show in history. The Ghost Army divided into specialized components, each mastering a specific form of deception. The 603rd Camouflage Engineers handled visual trickery. The 3132nd Signal Service Company created sonic deceptions. The Signal Company Special practiced radio fakery, or spoof radio. The 406th Engineer Combat Company provided security and support. At Camp Forest, Tennessee, and later at Pine Camp, New York, now Fort Drum, they trained with equipment that seemed to belong in a circus rather than a war. Inflatable tanks made of rubber and air, dummy artillery pieces constructed from plywood and canvas, fake aircraft that could be assembled in minutes, all designed to look absolutely convincing from the air but weigh almost nothing. The Sonic Unit worked with engineers from Bell Labs, the telecommunications giant, to create something revolutionary. They traveled to Fort Knox and recorded actual sounds of armored divisions and infantry units onto state-of-the-art wire recorders, the predecessor to tape recorders. Tank engines, artillery fire, troops marching, construction sounds. Everything an army makes when it moves and prepares for battle. Then they mounted these recordings on powerful amplifiers and speakers attached to half-tracks, armored vehicles with wheels in front and tracks in back. The speakers could project sound 15 miles away, loud enough to convince enemy listeners that massive formations were moving through the darkness. But the centerpiece of Fortitude South wasn't the Ghost Army. It was something even more audacious: the first U.S. Army group, FUSAG. FUSAG existed only on paper, in radio transmissions, and in the minds of German intelligence officers. On paper, it comprised 11 divisions, approximately 150,000 men. Its order of battle looked formidable: the 3rd U.S. Army, several corps, multiple divisions of infantry and armor, all supposedly stationed across southeastern England, perfectly positioned to strike across the Channel at Pas-de-Calais. The commander of this phantom force had to be someone the Germans would absolutely believe would lead the main invasion, someone they feared, someone they respected above all other Allied generals: Lieutenant General George S. Patton. Old blood and guts. The man who had crushed German forces in North Africa and Sicily with aggressive, almost reckless tactics. German commanders studied his campaigns, analyzed his methods, feared his battlefield instincts. After the successful invasion of Sicily in 1943, German military intelligence rated him as the Allies' most dangerous general. The irony was bitter for Patton. He had been relieved of field command after slapping 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue during the Sicily campaign. The incidents became a public relations disaster. Patton, who lived for combat and glory, found himself sidelined just as the greatest invasion in history was being planned. The Allies turned his disgrace into opportunity. In early 1944, Patton was publicly announced as commander of FUSAG. To German intelligence, this made perfect sense. Of course the Allies would give their best general command of their largest army group. Of course they would pretend to fire him to throw the Germans off. The Germans believed what they wanted to believe, that Patton was too valuable to waste, that his firing was obviously a deception to hide his true role. They were being deceived about a deception, a double blind that worked precisely because it seemed too clever to be the truth. Patton played his role perfectly. He toured southeastern England, giving speeches at women's clubs, appearing at public events, being photographed inspecting dummy installations. Once, meeting Brigadier General James Gavin in a London hotel lobby, he said goodbye loudly enough for any lurking spies to hear. "See you in the Pas de Calais, Gavin." While Patton served as the public face of FUSAG, the real machinery of deception operated in shadows and whispers, through channels the Germans believed they controlled but had actually lost years earlier. Britain's MI5 had achieved something extraordinary. They had captured or turned virtually every German spy operating in the United Kingdom. The famous double-cross system, managed by the 20 Committee, written as XX, the Roman numeral for 20, which also formed a double cross, controlled a network of double agents who fed carefully crafted misinformation back to German intelligence. But the crown jewel, the double agent who would make or break Fortitude South, wasn't even British. He was a failed Spanish chicken farmer named Juan Pujol Garcia. Pujol's path to becoming arguably the greatest double agent of World War II bordered on comedy. In 1941, burning with hatred for fascism after experiencing the Spanish Civil War from both sides, he approached British intelligence 3 times, offering to spy for them. 3 times they rejected him. Undeterred, Pujol contacted German intelligence instead, posing as a fanatical pro-Nazi Spanish official who could travel to London. The Germans recruited him. Only then did British intelligence finally take notice and bring him on board, giving him the codename Garbo, after actress Greta Garbo, because his acting skills rivaled Hollywood's finest. Working with his MI5 handler Thomas Harris, Pujol created an imaginary network of 27 sub-agents. A Dutch airline worker, a Gibraltarian waiter, a Welsh fascist, each with detailed backstories, personalities, and capabilities. Between them, Pujol and Harris wrote 315 letters, averaging 2,000 words each, maintaining the fiction of this vast spy network. The Germans were so convinced of Garbo's network that they paid him a total of $340,000 over the course of the war, roughly $5 million in today's money, to support his non-existent agents. They flooded German intelligence in Spain with so much information that the Abwehr made no further attempts to infiltrate new spies into Britain. Garbo's reports mixed accurate but useless information with complete fiction, always delivered in verbose, fanatical prose that convinced his German handlers he was risking his life for the Führer's new world order. Everything had been building to this moment. Everything depended on whether Hitler would believe what Garbo told him about D-Day. As spring 1944 arrived, the Ghost Army deployed to Britain. They sailed from New York in early May, just weeks before D-Day, and set up near Stratford-upon-Avon. Their work began immediately. Under Operation Quicksilver, a sub-operation of Fortitude South, they began creating FUSAG's physical presence. Across the fields of Kent, Essex, and East Anglia, inflatable tanks appeared overnight. Not just a few, hundreds of them. From the air, they looked identical to real M4 Sherman tanks. Dummy landing craft, nicknamed Big Bobs, filled harbors and estuaries around Dover and the southeastern coast. Built from scaffolding tube, wood, canvas, and empty 40-gallon barrels, they bobbed convincingly in the water. The attention to detail was obsessive. Artists among the Ghost Army deliberately camouflaged the fake equipment imperfectly, knowing German photo analysts would see through camouflage that was too perfect and become suspicious. They hung laundry on clotheslines outside fake barracks. They drove real jeeps and trucks in loops around dummy positions to create realistic tire tracks in the mud. They lit fires to simulate cooking and heating. German reconnaissance flights photographed it all. Intelligence analysts in Berlin pored over the images, counting tanks, estimating troop strength, mapping supply depots. Every photograph confirmed what they already believed. The Allies were massing an enormous force in southeastern England, positioned perfectly to strike at Pas-de-Calais. Meanwhile, 800 miles away, the real invasion force was assembling along England's southern coast, near Portsmouth, Southampton, and Plymouth, aimed at Normandy. The radio deception component proved equally crucial. Ghost Army operators, armed with an 8-inch thick book of scripted transmissions, created the radio signature of a massive army group. They mimicked the communication patterns of real units. Different Morse code operators have distinctive fists, personal styles of sending code. The Ghost Army's radio specialists studied these signatures and replicated them perfectly, making it seem like actual units and their familiar operators had simply moved to new positions in southeastern England. German signals intelligence, listening across the channel, picked up this traffic and plotted unit movements based on the fake communications. Every intercept confirmed the deception. FUSAG was real. FUSAG was growing. FUSAG was preparing to invade Pas-de-Calais. The Allies took risks that seemed almost reckless in their boldness. They needed to sell the deception not just to German intelligence analysts far away in Berlin, but to the German High Command's most experienced field officers. In May 1944, General Hans Kramer, a captured Afrika Korps commander, was being repatriated to Germany due to poor health through a prisoner exchange. Before sending him back, British intelligence arranged for him to have dinner with General Patton, who was introduced as the commander of FUSAG. Patton, playing his role with characteristic flair, repeatedly mentioned the Pas-de-Calais during their conversation. Other Allied officers deliberately let slip seemingly sensitive information about FUSAG's preparations. Then, as Kramer was driven to his departure point for Sweden, he passed through town after town filled with troops, vehicles, and military infrastructure. The road signs he saw indicated he was in southeastern England. The guards' loose talk confirmed it. Kramer was shaken by the scale of what he witnessed. This FUSAG force was even more formidable than German intelligence had estimated. But it was all theater. Kramer had actually been driven through southwestern England, where the real invasion preparations for Normandy were taking place. Every road sign had been temporarily changed. Every guard had been coached. The actual invasion force was being displayed to him as proof of the fictional one. On May 23, Kramer shipped to neutral Sweden, then made his way back to Germany, where he was exhaustively debriefed. His eyewitness account, from one of their own trusted generals, removed any remaining doubts in the German High Command. FUSAG was real. Patton would command it. The main invasion would strike at Pas-de-Calais. Hitler, already predisposed to believe this based on geographic logic, now had confirmation from multiple independent sources. He reinforced the 15th Army at Pas-de-Calais. He kept 13 divisions locked in Norway, convinced by Fortitude North's deceptions that an attack there was also possible. His Atlantic wall was strong everywhere, but strongest exactly where the Allies would not attack. The stage was set, but the most critical 48 hours of the deception were still ahead. If it failed now, the invasion would fail, and tens of thousands would die. June 5, 1944. The invasion fleet sailed from southern England under cover of darkness and foul weather. More than 5,000 ships carrying 156,000 men crossed the Channel toward Normandy's beaches, the largest armada ever assembled in human history. In southeastern England, the Ghost Army went into overdrive. Sonic trucks positioned themselves strategically and began broadcasting the sounds of tanks moving, troops assembling, construction crews building pontoon bridges. The noise carried for miles across the nighttime countryside, creating the impression that Fusag was making final preparations for its own invasion. Radio traffic surged. False messages flew back and forth between phantom units. Allied aircraft dropped strips of aluminum foil called window over the Pas-de-Calais area, creating radar signatures that looked like a massive fleet approaching from the southeast. Small boats and aircraft moved in formation toward Calais, maintaining the illusion. At 3 o'clock in the morning on June 6th, Agent Garbo attempted to make contact with his German handlers. Arrangements had been made days earlier for them to be listening at this exact time. One of his sub-agents supposedly had critical information. But the German radio operators weren't at their posts. Garbo's transmission went unanswered for 5 hours. When contact was finally established at 8 a.m., Garbo was furious. In colorful, angry terms, he expressed his disgust of their negligence. But the delay actually worked in his favor. By 8 a.m., Allied troops were already landing at Normandy, and Garbo could add fresh operational details to his report, making it seem even more urgent and credible. His message was simple but devastating. I have received intelligence from several sources that the Normandy landings are a diversionary maneuver. The real invasion force under General Patton remains in southeastern England, preparing to strike at Pas-de-Calais. Fusag has not yet been committed to battle. You must not, I repeat, must not, weaken your defenses at Calais to reinforce Normandy. 3 days later, on June 9, Garbo sent his masterpiece, a 3,000-word telegram that would reach Adolf Hitler himself. Garbo's June 9 message to German intelligence was forwarded directly to the Oberkommando der Wehrmacht, the German Armed Forces High Command, and reached Hitler's desk. In it, Garbo claimed he had conferred with his top agents and developed a complete order of battle showing 75 Allied divisions stationed in Britain. The real number was about 50. He explained that Fusag, comprising 11 divisions under Patton's command, had not participated in the Normandy assault. Therefore, he argued, the Normandy landings must be a feint, a diversionary attack designed to draw German reserves away from the real target. The main invasion force was still waiting in southeastern England, poised to strike at Pas-de-Calais when German defenses there were weakened. The Germans sent back a message praising Garbo's work. All reports received in the last week from Arabelle, Garbo's German codename, undertaking have been confirmed without exception. Hitler believed him completely. This was the critical moment. German panzer divisions were already on the move, heading toward Normandy to crush the Allied beachhead while it was still vulnerable. Hitler sent an order turning them around. The tanks that could have reached Normandy within hours instead returned to Pas-de-Calais, waiting for an invasion that would never come. The Allied forces, struggling to gain a foothold on the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy, were fighting against the German 7th Army, roughly 150,000 men. If the German 15th Army, another 150,000 soldiers, had reinforced them immediately, the Allies would have faced a 2-to-1 disadvantage. The invasion might have been thrown back into the sea. Instead, the 15th Army sat and waited, and waited. Days turned into weeks. Hitler refused to release reinforcements to Normandy for 7 full weeks. The Allies had hoped Fortitude South might buy them 2 weeks. 7 seemed impossible, almost miraculous. But Garbo's credibility was so high, the evidence supporting Fusag so convincing, that Hitler couldn't accept what his eyes were telling him was happening at Normandy. By the time reality penetrated his certainty, it was too late. The Allies had established an unbreakable foothold. The liberation of Europe had begun. The Ghost Army's work didn't end with D-Day. As Allied forces pushed deeper into France through the summer and fall of 1944, the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops conducted over 20 major deception operations, each one a carefully choreographed performance designed to mislead German commanders about Allied strength and intentions. 2 weeks after D-Day, Ghost Army units arrived in Normandy. Their first mission, simulate a Mulberry Harbor, the temporary portable harbors the British had designed, using lights at night to draw German artillery fire away from the real harbor installations. German gunners obligingly shelled the fake harbor, while the real ones continued operations unmolested. In September 1944, the Ghost Army helped tie down German defenders at Brest, a heavily fortified port city, by simulating a much larger encircling force than actually existed. The sonic trucks broadcast sounds of massive troop concentrations. Inflatable tanks appeared overnight in positions that suggested an overwhelming assault was imminent. German commanders, believing they faced impossible odds, surrendered the fortress with less resistance than anticipated. As Allied armies swept east across France, the Ghost Army moved with them, eventually basing themselves in Luxembourg. From there, they staged deceptions along the Maginot Line, in the Hurtgen Forest, and during river crossings of the Ruhr and Rhine. Each operation followed the same pattern: arrive in darkness, inflate hundreds of dummy vehicles, position sonic equipment, generate massive radio traffic, and create the impression of divisions where only a few hundred men actually stood. The operations were dangerous. The Ghost Army carried only light weapons, 50 caliber machine guns at most. If German forces had discovered they were fighting against rubber tanks and sound effects rather than real armor, the retaliation would have been brutal. 3 Ghost Army soldiers were killed during their campaigns, and dozens more were wounded. But they saved lives on a massive scale. Post-war analysis by U.S. Army historians estimated that the Ghost Army's deceptions saved between 15,000 and 30,000 American lives by forcing Germans to divert resources to defend against phantom threats, thinning their forces at actual battle sites. One analyst, studying their operations 30 years later while the missions were still classified, wrote, "Rarely, if ever, has there been a group of such a few men which had so great an influence on the outcome of a major military campaign." The Ghost Army's final and perhaps most brilliant operation came in March 1945, Operation Viersen, the crossing of the Rhine River into Germany itself. The U.S. Ninth Army planned to cross the Rhine near the town of Viersen, but German defenses along the river were formidable. Any crossing would face murderous fire from entrenched positions. The Ghost Army was tasked with convincing German commanders that the crossing would occur 10 miles south of the actual location. Over the course of several days, the 23rd assembled one of its most elaborate deceptions. They inflated more than 600 dummy vehicles, tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, creating the visual impression of 2 entire divisions massing for an assault. That represented approximately 40,000 soldiers. The sonic units worked overtime, playing recordings of pontoon boat construction. German listening posts picked up the distinctive sounds of engineers building river crossing equipment, hammering, sawing, diesel engines from boats. Radio traffic exploded with communications between phantom units coordinating the supposed assault. German reconnaissance confirmed the buildup. Artillery was repositioned. Infantry units moved into defensive positions. Reserves were called up and sent to defend against the massive assault everyone could see and hear preparing to strike. 10 miles north, the actual Ninth Army crossed the Rhine with minimal resistance. German defenses were elsewhere, waiting for an attack that existed only in sound and shadow. The operation was, in the words of the Army's official history, fortunately our best. The Ninth Army entered Germany and began the final push toward Berlin with casualties far lower than any planner had dared hope. But Operation Viersen revealed something else, something the Germans never discovered until after the war ended. The deception had worked so perfectly, had been executed with such skill, that some historians argue it demonstrated a principle that would haunt military thinking for decades. The weapon isn't always the thing that kills. Sometimes the weapon is the thing that makes your enemy believe something that isn't true. And belief, weaponized properly, can be more powerful than any artillery barrage. By the time Germany surrendered in May 1945, FUSAG had never been officially disbanded. The Phantom Army Group existed in German military intelligence files right up until the moment the Third Reich collapsed.
Agent Garbo's performance during and after D-Day earned him decorations from both sides, one of the few people in history to achieve such a distinction. On July 29, 1944, the Germans awarded him the Iron Cross Second Class, one of their highest military honors. The award normally required Hitler's personal authorization and was typically reserved for soldiers who had distinguished themselves in combat at the front lines. Garbo received his via radio transmission. The physical medal would be presented to him after the war, when Germany had won, and he could safely reveal his identity. 4 months later, on November 25, 1944, King George VI awarded Garbo the MBE, Member of the Order of the British Empire, for his services to the Allied cause. The Nazis never realized they had been fooled. Even after the war, when Allied deception operations were being discussed in historical accounts, Garbo's former German handlers refused to believe he had been a double agent. Some died still convinced he had been a loyal servant of the Third Reich, undone only by circumstances beyond his control. The psychological warfare had been that complete. Garbo had created a reality so convincing that even evidence to the contrary couldn't shatter it. After the war ended, the Ghost Army packed up their inflatable tanks, sound equipment, and radio gear. The soldiers who had spent more than a year creating illusions across Europe were sworn to secrecy. Their missions were classified at the highest levels. The equipment was recycled into the Army's Aggressor Force training program, used to create simulated enemy forces for practice exercises. Most of the Ghost Army soldiers returned to civilian life, carrying secrets they couldn't share. Bill Blass became a fashion designer. Ellsworth Kelly became a renowned artist. Arthur Singer illustrated wildlife books. Art Kane became a legendary photographer. They built successful careers, raised families, lived normal lives, never speaking about the time they had conjured armies from air and convinced Hitler's war machine to chase ghosts. The official records were locked away. The story disappeared into classified archives. And for more than 50 years, one of the most significant military operations of World War II existed only in fragments, in whispered stories, in memories that veterans couldn't share even with their families.
The first crack in the secrecy came in the 1970s when some details about wartime deception operations began to emerge in historical accounts. But the full story remained classified. In 1985, Juan Puyol Garcia finally broke his silence, publishing his autobiography under his own name. He had faked his death years earlier to escape the spotlight and lived quietly in Venezuela for decades. His children didn't know he was alive. When he was finally rediscovered and invited to Buckingham Palace for recognition of his service, it shocked everyone who thought the legendary Agent Garbo had died years before. The Ghost Army remained secret longer. It wasn't until 1996 that their operations were fully declassified. Suddenly, veterans who had been silent for half a century could finally tell their stories. In 2013, PBS released a documentary titled The Ghost Army, bringing their remarkable story to public attention. Historians began studying their missions in detail, analyzing how such a small unit had influenced such massive military operations. Then, in 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law the Ghost Army Congressional Gold Medal Act. On February 1, members of the Ghost Army, those still alive and the families of those who had passed, received Congress's highest civilian honor in recognition of their unique and highly distinguished service. The recognition came late, but it came. The men who had saved thousands of lives through artistry and deception, who had risked brutal retaliation if discovered, who had pioneered techniques that would influence military operations for generations, finally received acknowledgement for what they had done. But questions lingered. Post-war analysis by military historians revealed something troubling. The deception had worked almost too well. German military records showed that some commanders held such absolute conviction about Fusag's existence that they continued defensive preparations against it even after overwhelming evidence proved Normandy was the real invasion. In Hitler's final headquarters, in the bunker where he would eventually take his own life, maps still showed Fusag as a threat. The Phantom Army haunted German strategic planning right up until there was no Germany left to defend. The greatest trick the Allies ever pulled was convincing Hitler that the devil he feared most, Patton's mighty army, existed everywhere except where the real devils actually were. The aftermath of Operation Fortitude and the Ghost Army's campaigns rippled through military thinking for decades. The immediate impact was measurable in lives saved and victories achieved. The 7-week delay in German reinforcements reaching Normandy allowed Allied forces to establish an unbreakable beachhead. By the time Hitler finally accepted reality and released his 15th Army from Pas-de-Calais, the Allies had landed more than 800,000 troops, 150,000 vehicles, and 500,000 tons of supplies. Normandy had become an unstoppable fortress of its own. The broader strategic impact extended across all of 1944. Fortitude North kept 13 German divisions locked in Norway, guarding against an invasion that never came. Those divisions represented more than 200,000 soldiers who could have reinforced either the Western or Eastern fronts, but instead sat idle in Scandinavia, waiting for phantom British armies that existed only in radio transmissions and agent reports. The psychological impact on German command and control proved equally devastating. Hitler's paranoia, already a factor in his decision-making, intensified. He trusted his intelligence services less. He second-guessed field commanders more. The successful deception at Normandy made him suspicious of his own eyes, wondering what else might be illusion. Some historians argue that Fortitude's success contributed to Hitler's disastrous decision to launch the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, a massive surprise attack through the Ardennes that temporarily caught Allied forces off guard but ultimately failed. Hitler had learned that deception works, that conventional wisdom can be wrong, that attacking where the enemy least expects can succeed. But he failed to understand that deception requires comprehensive control of the information environment, something Germany no longer possessed by late 1944. For the Allies, Fortitude validated the concept of information warfare as equal in importance to physical combat. The resources devoted to deception, the specialized units, the equipment, the time spent crafting and maintaining false narratives, had generated returns far exceeding their cost. The Ghost Army's techniques influenced the development of modern psychological operations and information warfare capabilities. The U.S. Army's psychological operations community adopted the Ghost Army's insignia as an unofficial symbol. The principles they pioneered, multimedia deception, attention to detail, believable narratives built on partial truths, remained foundational in modern military doctrine.
Today, in an era of deepfakes, information warfare, and digital deception, the Ghost Army's story feels both ancient and urgently relevant. They proved that armies can be defeated before battles begin if you control what the enemy believes. The inflatable tanks are gone.
None are known to survive, though museums display recreations. The sonic equipment was recycled decades ago. The radio scripts have been archived, but the lessons remain. In 2022, as the Ghost Army veterans and their families received the Congressional Gold Medal, the youngest survivors were in their late 90s. Soon, there will be no living witnesses to what they accomplished. But their legacy lives in every military operation that incorporates deception, every strategic communication campaign, every recognition that perception can matter as much as reality. The men who served in the Ghost Army returned from war carrying secrets that weighed on them for half a century. They watched Hollywood make countless war films about D-Day, about Normandy, about the Allied push through Europe. They saw Patton lionized and mythologized. They knew their part in it, but couldn't speak. When they finally could, some found that the world had trouble believing them. Inflatable tanks? Recordings of fake armies? A Spanish chicken farmer with 27 imaginary spies? It sounded like fiction. But it was real. Every detail verified through declassified documents, German records captured after the war, contemporary reports from Allied command. Real enough to fool Hitler. Real enough to save tens of thousands of lives. Real enough to change the course of history. The hidden army that fooled the German high command proved something profound about warfare. The most powerful weapon isn't always the one that kills the most enemies. Sometimes it's the one that makes your enemies kill themselves through their own misdirected responses. In the end, Fusog never fired a shot. Patton's Phantom Force never crossed the Channel. The greatest American Army group of World War II existed only in air, sound, radio waves, and belief. And yet, it helped win the war. Every event, number, and name in this documentary has been verified through historical and documented sources. Thanks for watching. Subscribe for more hidden histories that changed the world. Drop a comment sharing what surprised you most about this story.